Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we are going to discuss full software lifecycle testing and why it matters for your mobile app development. I'm Ashwini Sathe. I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Sauce Labs, and please join me in welcoming Mike Donovan, Vice President of Products Test Automation at Sauce Labs, as our speaker today. So what's on the agenda? Mike will be discussing the market dynamics and how that's really shaping the future of mobile app development and testing. He will highlight some key common challenges we are seeing. We are hearing from our customers that they're facing at every stage of the SDLC. And then we'll move on to discussing how you can really embrace full software lifecycle testing to build a more holistic strategy around your mobile app quality as well as the customer experience. Before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping items to review. You should see a Zoom webinar control panel at the bottom of the window. So please use the Q&A feature there to submit your questions at any time during this presentation. We'll ensure that we'll cover as many questions as we can at the end of this session. If you have any technical issues or need support during the webinar, you can contact us via the Zoom chat or email us at webinar@saucelabs.com. I'll put this info in the chat as well, so you can have it for review. Finally, we'd also be recording this webinar, so you will receive an email with the link to the recording and the slides just in a few days. With that, we really hope you find this content relevant and valuable, and I would now like to pass it over to Mike to get us started.
Thanks, Ashwini, and thanks everyone for joining. It should be fun. Let's get into it. First, I'll introduce myself. As Ashwini said, I'm Mike Donovan, VP of Product here at Sauce Labs. My background is really in full stack software engineering. I spent 15 years as a full stack software engineer. I'm one of those software engineers, though, that turned to product management as I found my really love for helping users solve problems that grow a business. When I'm not thinking about the software world, you can find me on my mountain bike or homebrewing for those beer lovers out there. My LinkedIn links are there. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I love talking about all of these things that we're going to talk about today and anything else related to software. So let's set the stage with what's happening across the market that's really driving new testing trends. And I think to understand today's market, it's useful to understand the context that's really driven some of the key shifts in technology. The first era that I think about when I think about what's driving software practices to evolve takes me back to the beginning of my career, really, and what we refer to as the silo era, right? This is when it was releases of software were much less frequent. The on-premise deployment model was very prevalent. That was really the main way to deliver software, maybe even sort of shipping a binary over to your customer. And that led to really longer release cycles, maybe quarterly, annual releases. And the architectures also reflected that ability through more monoliths. And I think at that point in time, it was really all about how do we deliver the functionality and learn what functionality we need, not so much what would make it most valuable for users, and definitely the user experience was an afterthought. Then we enter what we call the SaaS era, right? The software as a service era. And this is really came about as the browser became one of the key ways to deliver your products to market. Because of that ability to deliver your product to market in a simpler way and a more easy way, it led to faster release cycles, right? Maybe weekly cycles. Agile became a major practice in response to this, and you started to see weekly, bi-weekly cycles of releases. It's also where test automation became a big deal, right? Because now in order to ensure quality was meeting the needs of your users on that weekly release cycle, you needed some way to validate the system was working as expected. And that's where test automation and Selenium came about. It also led to different architectures, right? Microservices started to become more of a standard practice during this time because of the separation, right, of the back end and the front end. And you started to see user experience become a major player in development teams and a big differentiator for companies. But quality still an issue, right? I remember saying this so many times in my development career that hard to reproduce the issue. It worked on my machine, right? But that did lead to a lot of great advances in products out there. And then after that, we entered into what we call the DevOps era, right? And this is where the rise of IoT devices, mobile, just the way that technology is now infused into our life, it really means that software is all around us. And because of that, and because of new technology that allowed you to release faster, continuous integration and continuous deployment became standard practice, right? That was really, and as well as cloud providers and all that. And that also, because of now instead of moving from weekly releases, maybe to daily or multiple times a day releases across different microservices, it really meant that everyone across the team and company, in many cases, owns quality, right? It's no longer siloed to a specific team. And so that also brings with it new challenges, right? And I talked about how the growth of different device types and IoT and mobile really is a big change. And I think that's really one of the biggest changes we see as we enter into this next era, right? The rise of mobile. So let's go a little deeper into that. Now I'm going to show you some numbers that sort of bring to light how prevalent mobile applications are now across our life. And I bet you it won't be that surprising, but they're still astounding numbers. From 2016 to 2021, we see a tremendous increase in the number of mobile apps that are downloaded across the world, right? And they're just connecting people in different ways and delivering products in brand new ways to your end user. It's a huge market, right? The projected revenue of mobile apps in total, as we look to 2025, is over $500 billion. It's just if you want to be making money in today's economy, you're going to be using mobile. And users have more access than ever to the internet, which is what powers the rise of mobile, right? And this is definitely something that's evolved greatly over the years now. And it really means that your application is global no matter what, and has the access to a global user base. So all of these stats, they really do highlight the importance of mobile applications for businesses as they try to grow and reach new users. But from a development point of view, creating mobile apps, maintaining them does bring unique challenges to development teams. It is a lot harder to roll back releases, right? When you almost have to always roll forward, because as your users download that latest version, you can't take it back, right? So quality is really important in that situation. You've also got a complex and unpredictable stack. There's hundreds of different device combinations out there, different frameworks to choose from. It across the front end and back end, it just becomes a more complicated stack of technology to deal with. And then finally, it's very hard to simulate the customer experience in your development practices, or when you're writing tests, or in your quality practices, because there's just so much variability out there to understand exactly what your user was doing at any given moment that maybe produced that issue. And so while mobile, right, is a great major growth driver, I think we're clearly seeing that it brings with it new development challenges. And those challenges, they come with a cost, right? If you do make a mistake, if mistakes are made in terms of negative reviews that might be written by your end user, can have a tremendous impact on abandonment during your key flows, right? We have some stats here around for shopping cart experiences on e-commerce. Just how much people will just abandon your brand after they have one poor experience, and when you're in a competitive market, that really can make or break your company. We also see how errors are such a huge problem when they get all the way to users, and when you see your app crash or freeze, they're just going to uninstall it the first time that they see that happen, or at least half of them will, according to our surveys. And so if you can create a great experience, right, and you can maybe get that one extra star on your reviews, that will have, that changes your business trajectory tremendously, right? But on the opposite side, if you have a low rating because of a poor experience, maybe because of crashes or freezes or errors or bugs that leak into production, then you're just not going to see the adoption rate that your company needs in order to grow. So the rewards are very high, but so are the risks, right? And the cost of a poor experience is really high, and those user expectations are higher than ever as well. So the growth in mobile has truly integrated digital experiences into our everyday life, right? Software is everywhere. User expectations are higher than ever, no matter what the interaction is, right? Whether it's a game, whether it's a point of sale machine, or whether it's a developer tool. Every experience really matters. So how are development teams answering the call to deliver on these expectations, these very high expectations to deliver in the market? And how is test changing to deliver great experiences to end users? We're going to talk about the development teams now. So we see some major changes in how development is adjusting to some of these market dynamics, right? We talked a little bit about how release velocity is increasing, right? And that's a key enabler to businesses. But as survey after survey shows, tests still remain a key bottleneck, right? As you go through your pipelines, it increase, and you hit your testing phases. They take a long time to get feedback, and they ultimately increase your lead time to changes. We also see testing shifting both left and right. And what we mean by that is just earlier in the development process, as well as later during different later stages after release and deploy into production, right? And so we see companies trying to incorporate different testing practices across the software development lifecycle, with challenges though, because that brings new personas into the mix, right? People who were not part of the quality practice before, whether it be designers, customer support, product management, engineers, QA, all those people now are focused on bringing high quality software to market. And with those people come new tools, new frameworks that they need to do their job. So the tool space gets complex. And then I think that we're seeing also companies experiment in new way with new different tools in production, right? Through faster release cycles, they can now release smaller changes into production, observe how those changes impact real world users, and then determine if they're meeting the expectations of quality in production. So a lot more production monitoring that's enabling companies to essentially move faster. In response to some of these market trends, we've seen tests generally being distributed into two main themes, main approaches, if you will. The first is intent-based testing, right? And this is really what has been the driver of the test automation space for a while now, right? And intent-based testing is all about writing tests that match what you intended the software to do, right? You built the software with certain intentions in mind, and therefore I'm going to write my tests to match those. But on the other side, and this is maybe the more modern approach that we're seeing, is instead of just factoring in what you intended the software to do, take a look at, observe what your users are doing in the real world through better error reporting, through better product analytics, and incorporate that into your testing strategy with the safety net of being able to have smaller releases, maybe through your microservice architecture, rolling back if you need to, but all of these being based on what you observe in production. So all these different practices that we're seeing and users are adopting and having issues adopting, new personas coming in. It also just means that there's a lot more tools that are involved in software development practices and in quality practice overall. When you see all these different tools, I'm sure some of you maybe notice some tools on here that you use every day, maybe some that are on here that you don't. But it means more integrations need to be created, right? It's a burden. you have to train your teams. You have to empower them to use these tools, make sure they get adopted and used appropriately. That's difficult. You have a lot more vendors that you have to start managing. And data silos become a big problem as well if these tools aren't integrated correctly. And that essentially creates this complex web of tools that can be very hard to manage. And so in summary, right, we see that in response to a lot of those market dynamics and the new demands of users, some users still relying on more testing, right? Just reinvesting in that intent-based testing and not maybe thinking about other approaches. We're seeing more people involved in quality, which then makes it more complex, which brings more tooling to answer the needs of those different people. And all those things together, if just left alone, increase the complexity that ultimately delays your ability to release your key features to your customers. Now let's see how this complexity impacts the software development lifecycle and what Sauce Labs is doing to help. So I'm going to start by walking through some of the key challenges at each phase that we see in the software development lifecycle, right? We're seeing this across the industry. In the build phase, we're seeing front-end and back-end development not communicating as efficiently as they could, right? Where there's either miscommunication, misalignment on requirements happening, not understanding maybe what the API contract should look like that would power that front end, and really not being able to work in parallel. And it all just boils down to a lack of communication. We also see that unit testing, especially in mobile, can be very hard to scale as you're looking to run it across a lot of different teams and devices, or when you just have a lot more tests that you're trying to run for your XCUI or Espresso tests. Then we move on to the testing phase, right? And this is maybe where we would normally put a lot of functional UI testing, but that's just the problem, right? We see users relying way too much on functional UI tests as the only way that they're responding to these demands of quality, and that just slows down your pipeline. We also see that you're dealing with the massive variability in devices and operating systems, and you do want to incorporate that into your testing strategy, but you want it to be done efficiently. And you obviously, customers struggle with maintaining all those different variability in devices and operating systems. And then again, the scale of running these automated tests is still a big challenge, right? Especially as you try to incorporate different platforms and operating systems into your practice. But it doesn't stop there, right? As we go through our testing phase, we enter into the debugging phase. And this is, when a test fails, when there's an error that you notice in pre-production, what are we doing to debug it and solve it and get our pipelines moving again? And we see a lot of development teams wasting time reproducing issues that are found just to gather the context, recreate it, understand if it's a priority, and then ultimately fix it if it is a priority. But so many hours just wasted on how to reproduce that issue and gather enough context. Eventually, though, right, you're moving on, your release is certified, and you're able to deploy it. But in the mobile app space, this is also a big challenge. App distribution is fairly complex, and there's really there's a terrible user experience out there for development teams who are trying to get their application into the hands of others on their team or real world users for validation. There's not really that great of an experience out there, and it delays the development time. The existing tools out there as well, if you want to run beta testing from Google and Apple, they're really not made for collecting feedback from your real world users. And so that slows down development again, going back to that debugging problems. And that's what creates a costly environment for fixing issues. Eventually, you're also going to release, and you want to operate this application in production. And it's really unclear, maybe when you see an issue, why and how that issue occurred, right? What was the context of the user when they experienced that issue? And is that even, again, an issue that you need to prioritize? And you don't know overall, if you look across all your user base, is my application healthy? It's very hard to understand if that's happening or not. And you, in some ways, you're just flying blind. And all of this creates many problems, right? You're seeing a slow feedback loop from production into your development teams. When you are going to deploy, there's a low confidence to deploy. You're not exactly sure if that application will meet the quality standards of your users. When you're in development, it can be hard to verify the functionality because you don't know when you see an issue if it's a real issue that matters. If I need to reproduce that issue, I'm not sure if it takes a long time to do that, and as well as the scale of tests across your pipelines moving slower. And then ultimately, your builds can then become unstable, and it just distracts you from actually delivering the product velocity that you need. And so before we get into how Sauce Labs is working through some of these challenges, I want to send out a quick poll. So I think you see the poll up there now. We're just asking which of the following is the biggest challenges in your mobile app development processes? Maybe it's communication between teams. Maybe it's slow tests in your pipelines. Maybe it's too much time spent on that debugging and reproducing of failures, gathering real user feedback, or prioritizing errors that happen in production. Oh, this is so honestly, unsurprisingly, seeing that the majority of you are, or a near majority of you are saying the too much time spent reproducing and debugging tests. I think that this is one of the key things slowing down deployments across the industry, and it's great. What's exciting for me at Sauce Labs is that this is a challenge I think we're positioned to help with. Cool. Okay, so great to see. So now let's talk about what Sauce Labs is doing to help solve some of these problems. So we go back to those phases of the software development lifecycle as we see it for this, right? And we're doing some things to help development teams solve those challenges, right? We're bringing some very exciting new features and technologies to market, really integrated into a first of its kind tool chain. So as we look at the build phase, right? Sauce Labs added support for mobile unit testing frameworks like XCUI and Expresso to be able to run those at scale across real devices and emulators and simulators. Really seeing that improve the speed at which builds are being executed at scale. We also talked about how front-end and back-end teams not communicating as well as they could. And that's where we brought to market an API testing solution that really empowers teams to have an API-first driven development approach with contract testing and mocking capabilities. And that really enables both those front-end and back-end teams, or maybe the producers and the consumers of APIs, to develop in parallel, agree on a spec, and then move forward and rather than get lost in communication challenges of what the API will do. As we move to test, we have a highly scalable real device cloud that allows you to test on thousands of different mobile phones and operating systems across Android and iPhone and others. So that really helps with the scaling that testing. But we also are one of the best in the industry on our emulators and simulators. So for even greater scale of testing, especially for functional testing, you can use our emulators and simulators to validate the majority of your test cases. We also see API testing playing a role in this phase, right? Because our API testing solution is different than the others in that it also enables you to write functional API tests. So this is where you can string together multiple API calls with some amount of logic, for loops, if statements, that kind of thing, so that you can actually replicate different end-to-end scenarios that your users are doing. And finally, to help remove the bottleneck that can be functional UI testing for, so heavily relying on functional UI testing as a bottleneck. We have a visual regression tool that enables you to do screenshot testing and component testing, image capture comparisons over time, which can really cover a lot of different test cases rather than relying too much on functional UI testing. So really trying to figure out how to disperse testing to avoid the bottlenecks of functional UI testing. In the debug phase, in the poll we just did, you said this was really the place where you're spending a lot of wasted time, right? Or time that could be better optimized. And so we're bringing a whole lot of new features here. I'll show some screenshots of them, but we're adding the ability to see on a real device what were the vitals during that execution time, like the CPU and memory, the ability to capture network calls that were made, so that that's oftentimes the source of failures. We're also able to capture the errors and crashes and exceptions that might have occurred in the actual application during your test run to, again, not have to reproduce the issue, get all the information and context necessary to fix it rather than having to waste the time reproducing it. And then we've also brought to market a mobile app beta testing solution that not only helps you execute a mobile beta program with real world users for maybe a private closed beta or a more public beta, but it also helps you distribute your application bundles to different users, whether that be internal or to the actual Apple and Google stores. All of these things ultimately improve the release velocity, enabling you to incorporate those signals from production into your pre-production quality checks, right? And so we're collecting, we also have an error and crash reporting capability now through our acquisition of Backtrace, where we're able to monitor what's happening in production. It adds that level of observability into all your application, helps you prioritize which issues and errors matter the most for your user base, and then ultimately incorporate that back into your quality practices in pre-production. All of these benefits, right, are really about improving that feedback loop that helps you understand what's happening in production, incorporate that back into your quality practices, and create more stable builds, verify the functionality faster, and make sure that you're ready to deploy as quickly as possible and get that deployment done, which also has an impact on your ability to plan what you need to build next, right? And make sure that you're just focused on whatever is going to help grow your business the most, grow your app adoption the most. So I'm super excited to show you how all this is coming to life for all users of Sauce Labs. So here's what, if you haven't come into Sauce Labs recently, here's what some of our test result page looks like. And we're going to talk about some new things in here that are coming to life. So all our users now, after you execute a real device test, get access to mobile app diagnostics, which includes the ability to see the interactions that happened during the test run, right? All the clicks and all the scrolls, all the taps, all of that, so you can really understand what the user was doing at any point in time. We're capturing network logs that occurred during your test with an interface that's very similar to when you do any sort of network inspection. So you can see which ones were failures, which ones were successes, so that you can ideally, you can highlight the API calls that failed as quickly as possible. We also collect CPU and memory as well as UI responsiveness statistics now throughout the life of the test. That can often be the cause for a failure, right? Maybe the CPU was spiked, you ran out of memory, some kind of memory leak, or it just wasn't as responsive as you needed it to be in order for your test to execute in time. So we're collecting all that over a timeline so you can see exactly at the failure point why it happened. And then finally, we talked about the incorporation of the backtrace capabilities into our real device cloud. This is where you're able to, if the application ever did have a crash or an error or an exception that happened, we're capturing that and giving it to you easy to interface with UI so that you can just know exactly what the context of the issue was. Again, so that you don't have to spend time recreating and debugging it locally, hopefully reducing the time to resolve. And all of this we're calling mobile app diagnostics, available today on any of your real device testing. Another key feature related to all this is our pattern analysis. This is helping you test smarter, test more intelligently, identify the failure patterns essentially that are causing your test to fail. So when you execute your tests in our tool, you're able to tell us if it's part of a CI build. And so we're analyzing all the tests that ran on that build and identifying failure patterns that are causing maybe multiple of your tests to fail. They're all related to the same root cause. So we identify those common failure reasons. And then we're giving you some root cause analysis with code references so that you know exactly maybe which line of code that's shared among all those tests is the one failing, so that you don't have to waste time debugging each individual test and instead can just fix the one root cause and then they all go green. So two very exciting features that we really think are helping our users debug faster and also make sure that they test the right thing and just get their velocity increased. So at Sauce Labs, we're really on a mission to redefine tests by incorporating quality signals across the entire software development lifecycles. We believe this will ultimately boost development speed without compromising quality. So we really are looking at this from a full development process picture and trying to fit and learning and bringing to market solutions that help our users in each phase, right? We talked about some of these already, between visual testing and the ability to convert a lot of those maybe functional UI tests into visual regression checks. Talked about API testing and how that's a key way to localize your testing to the failure point that it usually will happen, right? You can remove a lot of your functional UI tests by relying more on API tests, as well as helping speed up the development process through contract-based testing. And we also talked a lot about our ability to now monitor, observe what's happening in production through capturing errors, through capturing crashes and exceptions, aggregating all that up so that you can prioritize what your end users are experiencing and which issues need to be fixed, and then incorporating that back into your development, your quality practices in pre-production. And eventually, we're gonna be continuing this journey, right? We're gonna be eventually adding user journey monitoring, more insights in production that can be incorporated into your pre-production quality processes, so that you test the right thing at the right time, quickly, and improve velocity. So I think before we wrap up, we want to do one more poll. What testing strategies are you looking to adopt over the next year? Pick as many as you want. Interested to see which areas you're interested in and where you want to take your quality practices. See the results here. Looking at, I see visual regression testing. Yeah, I'm really excited to see more people adopt visual regression testing. I think it's a great way to not heavily rely so much on functional UI testing. I think one of our solution architects says that a picture is worth 100 tests. I like that phrase. Still seeing people really focusing on functional testing. I think that's great. I mean, there's definitely that's definitely a key part of any quality practice. And real devices, yeah, very interested in how we see different of our users dispersing tests between which ones they want to run on emulators and simulators, as well as real devices. So with that, I really appreciate everybody sticking through this. I think we'll jump into Q&A and then call it a day. Let's see what we got. Oh, Ashwini, I think you're muted.
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for that excellent presentation, Mike. We do have some interesting questions that have come in, so I'll read it out here. Just a reminder to our audience, please make sure that you are still posting any questions you have in the Q&A, as we have Mike right here to answer them. So we have the first question on how do you see codeless automation working for mobile app testing?
I see it working similarly to web app testing, right? I mean, I think that no matter many applications, even those for maybe internal business users, they're still bringing mobile apps to life, and it's the same. To me, it's the same challenges, right? Of having to scale your test automation practices and scaling it, who's going to write the tests and how they get executed and maintained. So I see that the same challenges that happen in web testing would apply to mobile testing as it relates to codeless automation. Our autonomic solution, which is our low-no-code solution, is very interesting because it has some machine learning capabilities within it that allow it to self-heal, right? And so as your elements change, location, and as your application changes throughout the development process, as new features come out, it doesn't mean that the tests need to be rewritten or updated. It'll auto heal, and I think that's a key. It's going to be key in mobile just as it's key in web.
Absolutely. Another question is, what are your future plans to support the latest version of Ionic and Capacitor?
So we are constantly evaluating every new framework that comes out. Based on adoption, and based on adoption, and based on what would impact the most of our users. And so Ionic is definitely within our sights, as is really all of the hybrid and cross-native, cross-platform frameworks.
That's good. Another one is from Suyog, and he wants to know, is it possible to trigger build to source labs from Azure DevOps pipelines?
So we have a lot of customers integrating sauce labs into their CI pipelines generally. Azure DevOps is definitely one of the ones we see more than others. I think that any of our, happy to talk about those specifics more. I see it successfully done time and time again. Any of our solution engineers could walk through that.
Yeah, and I've sent a link around to Suyog around our documentation around this, so that should definitely help you, Suyog. Some other questions we also have, Mike, is around how can we try the mobile app diagnostic features that you discussed today?
So all you have to do is execute a manual or automated test in Sauce Labs, and when you go view the test result page, you will see all those. You'll see that whole screenshot. You'll see the CPU and memory. You'll see the device vitals. You'll see the network capture, the interactions. All that just comes with executing tests on Sauce Labs.
Mm-hmm. Are you seeing any typical way your customers are adopting emulators and simulators into their testing practices?
Yeah, great question. I think that this is one of the definitely the interesting areas to see here, where a lot of customers are relying heavily on emulators and simulators earlier in their pipelines, maybe for more of their functional testing in mobile, and then they will pull in real devices later on in the pipeline to validate some of those more device-specific test cases or UI-specific test cases, end-to-end business flows, if you will, later in their pipeline, and again at scale with Sauce Labs. But we really see customers adopting both across their quality practices.
Yeah, that's accurate. And you also talked about error reporting in production, as we talked through the SDLC phases. So how are you seeing the error reporting in production kind of helping teams in the pre-production stages?
I think it's helping teams really understand what needs to be tested, right? What is very important to test, and maybe what is less important to test. And it helps you just prioritize those experiences and issues that happen, so that your development teams can run faster. And so I think, and then the other thing that I think is really interesting about the solution we're bringing to market is These are tools that in production, when you're adding observability to your mobile apps or web apps, development teams are used to seeing these tools, but pre-production, there's not a whole lot of observability that's added to the applications, which then again create those prolonged debugging cycles and having to reproduce the issues. So we see the industry focusing a lot on production observability, but we want to bring in that same observability pre-production so that you speed up your debugging process.
Yeah, that is so important. We'll just take a last question here. Can you elaborate a little bit more around our capability, like Sauce Labs capability to create API tests from mobile UI tests?
Yeah, so this is a great integration point for us here. When you execute your real device test, right, you get those network capture logs. It's a HAR file, a network a log file that's a standard format that you can download and put into any many tools out there if you need to. We have one that's sort of purpose built for Sauce Labs and debugging, but you can also take that and import it into our API testing solution, which will then generate an API test for you automatically, and then you can turn that functional UI test that's can potentially be more expensive and create that and remove that bottleneck by converting that to an API test. So it's basically just export from the functional UI test and import it into our API testing tool. And now you have an API test that'll run at scale.
Thank you, Mike, for today's webinar and this excellent conversation. And thank you to everyone for their attendance and all the great questions throughout the webinar. As I mentioned earlier, do stay tuned for a follow-up email that's coming your way. It will have a link to this webinar, the slides, and all other relevant resources related to mobile app testing and development. So on behalf of Sauce Labs, we'd like to thank you for your attendance and participation today. Have a great rest of your day.